Good evening, and welcome to Policy Matters. You are listening to Policy Matters, which is a Fort Wayne area League of Women Voters show about matters that of policy and of interest and upcoming events. We cover new topics each month, and shows are run on the second and fourth Wednesdays from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. So if you are listening, that's what time it is. These radio programs are also posted on our local League of Women Voters website, www.lwvfw.org. And you may check out previous shows by going there and looking at any shows that you might have missed. This show is going to be about gun safety or gun violence. And I have asked Brandon Blumenherst to join me today. You may or may not recall that he was a key player in the efforts to arrange several gatherings down at the courthouse, at the city courthouse, the county courthouse, after it's not the first shooting. There's been so many shootings,
exactly.
But one of the many shootings at schools that have happened that have caught our attention. And you may realize that relatively recently there has just been another incident in Noblesville here in Indiana that has really brought this topic home to Hoosier land. So we want to talk about this. You may ask, what does the League of Women Voters have to say about gun safety? And I will answer. There are actually policy positions on this topic at both the state and local and national level of the League of Women Voters. The National League took this topic up and created a position at their 1990 convention. That's how long ago. I'm sure it's been an issue before that, but this current policy stems from that time period. Here in Indiana, there's certainly been an interest in this as well. And in the last legislative session, the League of Women Voters from LaPorte County took this on as a primary goal of their chapter and put together kind of a summary of a position paper and was watching carefully at the state level and then sharing that information with all of the other leagues in the state to help us all stay informed. And I think I'll just start, if it's all right, with the position on gun control from the National League of Women Voters, and we can sort of just use that as an outline of the topics that we want to talk about, and then in addition to kind of the policy matters of gun violence and gun control, I also was interested in asking Brandon about what caused him to take this on as being sort of the main thing that he wanted to do, while also trying to go to school and have a life, and how does that work for the rest of us? Sometimes we have issues that we care a lot about, but maybe don't feel like we have the time to commit to, and then and how do we sustain that, or do we? And how do we make those transitions if we want to back off a little bit? So we'll have that conversation. I think that'll be really interesting too. But let's talk about policy first. So the League of Women Voters position on gun control is 1. The League of Women Voters of the United States believe that proliferation of handguns and semi-automatic assault weapons in the United States is a major health and safety threat to its citizens. I think many people would agree on that statement.
I think, when you look at the recent polling numbers with, I think it was the semi-automatic assault weapons, it's somewhere like 67% of America believes that, they should be banned. but also just talking about, different policies related to how many guns are in America, because I think it's somewhere around like 1 to 3 guns per citizen in America right now, which is it's a lot. So I think, people have started to look at, gun control as, a nonpartisan issue. And I think that that's kind of important in this environment, especially.
Right. And I think, the league's position starts out with just saying this is a health and safety threat. It doesn't really yet, point 2 and 3 further talk about sort of what do we do about it. But I think the first point is this is a problem. Needs to be addressed somehow.
Agreed. And I think there's been a prohibition on the CDC actually studying gun violence as a problem or a health hazard here in the United States. So I think that's a measure that a lot of people can get behind, is just, allowing the CDC to study this as a problem, a health hazard. Right.
It is a problem. It needs to be addressed. Let's study how to address it.
Exactly.
Okay, point 2. The League supports strong federal measures to limit the accessibility and regulate the ownership of these weapons by private citizens.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it was Scalia that said that, ownership of, or the Second Amendment is not unlimited. So, that coming from a court justice who is known for conservative opinions is, sort of a statement that really means something, not just to, people who support the Second Amendment or believe that it should be repealed, but it's just a blanket statement that says it's not unlimited. You have a right to own a firearm, but there are certain limitations within that.
Right. And I think the other thing that struck me is strong federal measures, because there's been efforts to say, oh, it's a state issue, but I think the League is pointing out that there needs to be a national policy that is consistent.
And I think there's also some, measures at the state level which could be mirrored at the federal level and be very, very effective. Like, and we'll probably talk about this later at some point, but like the red flag law here in Indiana, which, if someone poses an immediate threat to themselves or to others, the police can, take their weapons away or take possession of those weapons to temporarily, exactly, to try and neutralize that immediate threat.
Right. And I believe there was just a recent study that came out of IU just this last week or so, identifying the effectiveness of that rule. And I think that could be a good model for future legislation. It isn't all that often that Indiana gets to set a good example. So we should take advantage of that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Number 3, the League supports regulating firearms for customer safety.
I think that, again, it's just making sure that, people who shouldn't get guns don't have the opportunity to get them. People who, have a past history of, violent crimes or, bad mental health, things like that. I think that there are some, common sense measures that can be taken to, trying to regulate that for consumer safety.
Right. Right. So, yeah. And I think that, that doesn't say much, but it says a lot, actually. So it's like point of sale requirements.
Exactly.
Yeah. So at anywhere that you could purchase a gun legally. So at Walmart, at gun shows, at, wherever guns are sold, there needs to be regulation at the consumer level.
Yep.
That, people have to have some certain criteria in order to be able to make that transaction.
Yep.
Yeah. The League supports licensing procedures for gun ownership by private citizens to include a waiting period for background checks, personal identity verification, gun safety education, and annual license renewal. The license fee should be adequate to cover the cost of education and verification.
I think that's probably the most comprehensive point we've heard so far in the policy, just because it covers how the funding is going to be allocated, how strategic policy measures in terms of a waiting period. So a lot of people who, try and take try to use gun violence are kind of capricious in the sense that when they get angry, they get mad about something, they just want to go do it. And so a lot of times that waiting period can kind of create that gap in where they may think about their decision again and decide to, not commit the act that they're trying to do in the first place. But also it talks about background checks. 97% of Americans approve of background checks, universal background checks, in the sense, at gun shows, at gun sales shops, things like that. And just talking about gun safety education, identity verification, annual license renewal, that creates a paper trail that we can actually, make sure that these people went through all the steps that we would like them to make sure that they are responsible gun owners, which is what we're trying to do.
Right. I think one of the things that was an issue in the last state legislative session was to increase the length of time that a license would be valid. I think from like 2 to 3 years. Is that correct, or something like that? I don't
something
remember.
like it's. Yeah.
I can look that up. But this specifically states annual, every year, and I think that the policy here in Indiana is 2. I don't own a gun license. No, I think there was a lifetime permit as well. They were trying to get rid of the fee for the lifetime permit.
Gotcha.
And would change the 4-year permit to a 5-year permit. So I was way off on that one. So there is there is ability in Indiana, evidently, to get a lifetime handgun permit. There is still a fee associated with it because that didn't pass, I think. And evidently there is a 4-year limit for permits, and they were recommending to change it to 5. So quite different from the League of Women Voters position that it should be an annual registration opportunity. I think that one of the comments that I heard from one of the high school students that I thought was most valid was that you need to go through a lot to get a license to drive a car. You have to go through training. You have to take a test. You have to go through a probationary period. And while you can certainly kill somebody by driving a car, it is not as likely, and that's not even to own a car. That's just, to operate a car. That it seems kind of ridiculous to that person that it is so much easier to buy a gun than to operate a car.
Exactly. And I've talked to a couple police officers about this matter specifically because it's something that they deal with on a daily basis. And especially talking about waiting periods and things like that. One officer that I was talking to, she told me that, if you put a hammer and a gun in front of somebody when they're angry and they're ready to go do something, they're going to pick the one that can cause the most damage in the fastest amount of time, which is going to be a gun over a hammer. So, looking at that from that standpoint, police officers even recognize, that is an issue, that's a problem that we need to try and figure out. And I think it's becoming a more all-encompassing issue where people realize that it's not, a liberal issue or a conservative issue. It's about all of us together.
Right. So, when you look at that, list of requirements and compare that to what's currently in effect here in Indiana, and then how it varies from state to state, and of course, those are relatively easy items to transport from one place to another. And I know people argue that, well, certainly there's lots of illegal ways to obtain weapons. And that is true. And why punish the people who are going to use it? Well, I understand those arguments. I do. I totally do. But I think that it's the quantity and the availability that I think they're trying to address, and certainly to make sure that several of the homicides that have happened this year have been accidental or injuries, not necessarily deaths, but have been accidental gun issues where maybe a gun safety education and making sure that it was stored properly might have prevented those things from happening. And I think many people can think of examples of things that they've heard about on the news or maybe even have been involved with personally, where, wow, if people had just been a little more careful, that might not have happened. Okay, so the last point, number 5, the league supports a ban specifically on Saturday night specials, in quotation marks, enforcement of strict penalties for the improper possession of and crimes committed with handguns and assault weapons, and allocation of resources to better regulate and monitor the gun dealers. So I think that's sort of the laundry list of things that didn't fit everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Just to make it clear. Can you define what a Saturday night special is? What is that?
I am not. This is the one point where I was a little, not necessarily confused, but I think is a little vague in its definition.
It is, yeah.
So, I mean, I'm sure Saturday night special refers to some type of gun. I don't know what that is. Like,
but this was probably written like in 2004.
I was going to
so
say,
maybe that was like a cool term then. But.
Exactly. So I'm not entirely sure what that means. Right. But, I think it talks about, improper possession of and crimes committed with handguns and assault weapons and things like that. I think it's basically just trying to figure out, if you own a gun that you illegally got somehow, enforcing punishment for that.
Right. And maybe also punishment for, throughout the whole process for the person who gave it to them or sold it to them or whatever, just to sort of get that whole supply chain shut down as best they can. And certainly I know that, there was the war on drugs, which has caused a lot of people to be incarcerated for, drug infractions. And I think that, there has been a call from, a variety of different places to make a similar kind of effort to make sure that anything that is involving a weapon be similarly punished in a pretty significant way. And I think there are certainly mechanisms now for punishing people who do use weapons inappropriately. But I think that again, consistency is helpful in those areas. I think
Agreed.
As well. And then allocation of resources to better regulate and monitor gun dealers. So again, that's kind of going back to the source. And again, you can only regulate the legal aspect. I mean, I think people have made that argument with things like gambling. Should we have legalized gambling, or do we just do it under the table? And we might as well legalize it, so the state can tax it and monitor it and profit from it and whatever. So there's sort of pros and cons for all of that. There certainly is a legal mechanism for buying guns, and I don't think that people are necessarily recommending. Certainly, the league is not necessarily recommending that we shut that down completely, but it be regulated and monitored in a more effective way.
Yeah.
So of all of these things that we've just talked about, what's the counter argument? I mean, I guess I'm thinking, we're trying to be certainly non-biased here, and I can't particularly think of a counter argument for. I haven't seen a lot of people that are certainly pro-violence, but I know that there are certainly a lot of people who are pro, the right to bear arms,
exactly,
and keep government out of my business. Does this, putting on sort of, the other side's hat, how does this ever be construed as being over-restrictive?
I think a lot of people, playing kind of devil's advocate, they see it as an encroachment of government. They see it as, an encroachment on their right to bear arms, which, is unlimited, in their opinion, which, that depends on how you interpret. But I think they're a big push right now, anyways, from what I've seen online, especially amongst college students, is the right to carry on campus, which, it's, again, just kind of that I should have a right to protect myself on campus. I should have the right to bear arms wherever I am. And it's gaining traction. There's a lot of talk on a bunch of different campuses. It's kind of the same thing, with the rise of people like, David Hogg, the Parkland survivors, Emma Gonzalez, all those people who are, fighting for common sense gun control and things like that. There's also been, the other side's rising as well. Someone, her graduation pictures went viral because she was carrying an AR-15 on campus, and her graduation cap said something like, try and take it from me or something like that. But those went viral. And then, now she's become this sort of figure of, carrying on campus and trying to push for students to be able to, carry on campus and things like that. So I think a lot of people just see it as, I should be able to personally protect myself if something like, a Parkland incident or something like that were to happen, a mass shooting scenario would happen.
Right. Well, and they've talked, there have been proposals in the state legislature allowing teachers or requiring teachers to carry firearms in school. There were some training requirements and that sort of thing, so kind of more like deputizing more public safety officer type things. I remember back, how many years ago? 5 or 6 years ago, you were still a young child. It's like not that long ago. When the state of Indiana changed the rule about whether local communities could have more restrictive rules about where people could carry guns in their community. So I remember that in Fort Wayne, there were requirements, units of local government had requirements that said that you couldn't carry a gun in a public park or in the library where we are right now, or in a public transit system bus, or there were other units of government that have said, we're going to make restrictive rules that say that you can't do it here.
Exactly.
And the state rule very clearly said to units of local government, nope, you can't do that. You have to be, the state rule applies, and there are no additional restrictions that can be made. And so I know here at the library, for example, they had to change their policy, and that is when they put in the metal detectors, and had to work pretty hard. And I'm really not clear exactly what their policy is here, but I know that they can check to see if you have a weapon, and they can check to see if you have a permit to carry, and they have trained their security guards at the library to know, the proper procedure for doing that. And I believe, and I could be wrong, that, if it's properly licensed and if you have, permit, whatever the right permits and everything, they will allow you to carry the gun into the library. If you do not, then they can, refuse, they'll say, well, go lock it in your car, come back. I believe that's the policy. I'm not really sure. I know, in other places, they've, if it's concealed, a lot of times you don't even know.
Exactly.
If you don't have metal detectors, the buses don't have metal detectors, the parks don't have metal detectors, so it's a little difficult to tell. I know, on airplanes, obviously, they've made a big deal about it. That's a different, whole different system of carrying. But schools have an exception, and so schools and hospitals and, ironically, the General Assembly, or not ironically, can make rules. So that's why, as Brandon was saying, they're, on school campuses, like at Purdue Fort Wayne or Ivy Tech or any of the public schools, the schools can restrict people from bringing weapons or guns on campus. But in other public places that are governed by other governmental units, there's not an ability to make a similar restriction.
Exactly. And I mean, I just kind of want to touch on a point that you mentioned earlier about, teachers getting, required or have the option to be armed during classes. When you look at things like, police accuracy, I think it was somewhere around 34% of their shots are fired on target, and the remaining, 66% of them do not hit the target. And those are, trained officers who are practicing, weekly or monthly or things like that. Not school teachers or not students who could potentially be armed and trying to take out a school shooter. So when our, highest trained people are missing 66% of the time, I have, kind of a hard time understanding how, we could think about possibly arming, our teachers and our students and things like that. And another thing is just, it wasn't in their job description that they would have to try and take out a school shooter.
Right.
People get into that profession to teach. They get in that profession to, teach kids about how to be, smarter, how to, do math, how to become better people, not to try and, get into that situation.
Right. Well, I mean, at the complete other end of the spectrum, I've been involved in conversations with employees where I work about whether we train to do first aid, right? So, it's sort of like the similar argument. It's like, well, I'm not being paid to save lives, so if I receive this first aid training, at what point is my liability? At what point is the agency's liability? Should we even do first aid training? And that kind of gets to be an issue. Not for this topic, but if people can't even agree on whether it's important to train people to save lives, and you get into that with like Narcan and with AEDs. At what point are you training your workforce to be first responders? Then sort of the other side of that is like, well, at what point are you training your workforce to be snipers? And it's like, well, is that a good policy?
Exactly.
I don't really think so. So I think that another thing that slipped into my mind is, thinking of the Noblesville incident, and if you've been like living under a rock and hadn't heard about that, in Noblesville last week, 2 weeks ago.
I think it was 2 weeks
ago. 2 weeks ago, a student came in, shot another student 7 times. I
think
believe.
so, something like that.
Yeah, that just came out recently. It's like crazy number of times. She's still alive, hanging in there. Still, I believe, in pretty serious condition after being shot 7 times, I would think. And a teacher tackled the shooter. I will add that it is a teacher that was a trained tackler, right? So this is like a football player tackle. So he's actually received tackle training and did his job well.
Exactly.
Just extracurricularly, that was what he had done in his spare time, is he learned how to tackle people, and he did it well. But in the process of performing that tackle, got shot twice. I think
it's 3 times.
3 times. He's fine. Was like out in a couple of days. And doing well. But and in this scenario, the public safety officer for that school was not part of the conversation for whatever reason. I hadn't really heard where that person was, but that wasn't, the person who was trained to be the safety officer was not involved in the situation at that time. And so this, the teacher's a hero, and everybody's thinking that's just sort of an amazing thing. I can say that if I was a public school teacher, not having been trained to tackle people at all, let alone with guns, I don't know that I would have made that same call.
And I think that there's, I was reading letters to the editor the other day, and it's probably a month or 2 ago, where, someone wrote in that, we should be arming teachers better than we could possibly be arming criminals. So he was suggesting that teachers should have, AR-15s in the classroom, if not more.
Sure.
Yeah. So I see there's an argument there to be said in the sense that, if these people are trying to come in with these types of firearms, that there should be some force that is equal or equivalent to that force to counteract it. But I don't think that should necessarily be, on someone who has not been trained in that field.
Right. And I think that's a good segue. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about, the league position paper that I was referencing talks about the different bills that were introduced in the state legislature this last session, a short session, by the way, so that it doesn't usually tend to have to do with major policy decisions even in a short session. But there were, many people had suggestions on ways that state law could be changed to address gun violence issues, and there were and still are some federal issues that are pending on that topic as well. But one of the things that happened at the state level was that there were a few items that didn't get done during the general session that people wanted to still address, that they felt were critical enough to try and get enacted quickly this year. And so the governor called a special session for one day, wasn't even a whole day, to address a very limited docket of topics without really any discussion. It was just really kind of an opportunity to meet, vote, leave. But one of the topics that they wanted to discuss was funding for school safety programs. And so just to kind of familiarize you with what did pass, and, as Brandon was saying, there were all sorts of proposals about arming teachers and making guns easier to get and that sort of thing. Those didn't pass. But one of the things that did pass was this school safety bill. So I'll just kind of, as my brief summary of what I think the school safety bill included was primarily focused on training and studying and reporting. And so there's some additional funding to help pay for those efforts. And so basically the activities that they are trying to promote quickly and have already begun because it's passed actually it's effective July 1st, so I guess that hasn't actually quite begun. But training for school safety specialists, additional training, a statewide status report on school safety, additional web links and upgrades to state and local school websites with more safety information, a human trafficking training was slipped in, which is not necessarily related to gun violence, but is certainly a violence issue. Some enhanced language about cyberbullying, also kind of a violence issue. Some requirements for charter and private schools to have a safety plan and provide floor plans to first responders. Public schools were already required to do that, but there wasn't a requirement for the alternative schools. A requirement that would allow schools to adopt a policy to delay firearm evacuations by 3 minutes. The theory being there that somebody could pull the fire alarm, create some havoc, and during a mass exodus have some kind of a violent act, and cause people to like lemmings just run into the fire. So this gives a school safety officer or some other school professional an opportunity to take a moment, check and make sure the exits are clear, to the extent that 3 minutes makes a difference, to kind of help take a pause, make sure it's not a false alarm. and then some site visits and safety reviews. The funding mechanism attached to this, it provides an additional $1 million in safe school funding from the general fund. It provides an additional advance and another $5 million that could be added to this the state secured schools fund, and then allows for school systems and also charter schools to receive an advance on some of these their allocated funds in order to more quickly enact some of the security measures, things like if the schools choose to, things like putting more security officers around, including different kinds of upgrades to the schools that would allow for security measures, including a variety of different things, whatever the schools want to come up with. They would have to pay that back since it's a loan with interest, but it would allow them to levy taxes at the local level to help repay those funds. So that's sort of the general summary of that. So again, not really a lot of discussion during that special session on these things. So it'll be interesting to see kind of how those all pan out and how the schools decide to enact that. I would say that, there was the recognition, I guess, that funding needed to be provided for additional things. It's not like an unfunded mandate, which oftentimes comes down. So, to help pay for these things, there was some amount of funding that was tied to the bill to help make sure that schools have the resources to do what they're asking them to do. What do you think about these suggestions? Are those things that are going to be helpful? They're going to make a difference?
I think they're going to be helpful. However, I'll say this to start. I think that by doing nothing, we are, obviously doing nothing to help prevent this problem, but it's also a sign to everyone else that it's not an important issue, or it's not, an issue which we want to take on because it is so divisive. And when people, try to get to the root of the problem, depending on who you are, you can trace it back to, the guns or the people. And I feel like this specific bill, kind of traces it back to more about the people behind it, which isn't, terribly a bad thing. I think, a lot of measures in this bill were beneficial. I think it'll help us in the long run. But I think there's a lot more that we can do in terms of, regulating the sales of guns or, extending the process to which you have to go through to get a firearm or something like that. I think there's a lot more that we could do, at a state level, but, more preferably at the national level.
Right. Do you think, I think one of the things sometimes that happens, and I don't know that that's happening in this case, but when legislators go out of their way to try and have a special session saying, something needs to be done immediately. This is a statewide crisis, and I will add that all of this happened before the shooting in Noblesville. Nothing. The bill was passed, obviously. Some of the work hadn't started yet because it doesn't even go into effect until July with the next state fiscal year. But do we run the risk of them saying, check that, we did something, we're done, let's move on to roads or something? I
think we hit that with a lot of issues.
Right.
They do one thing and then it's like, well, we'll see how it pans out, and then it waits another 5 years. But I think school shootings was kind of a foreign problem here. In Indiana, they happened everywhere else, but it wasn't a problem here. And I think that a lot of states are recognizing that it's a growing problem. It is an epidemic that's, happening regularly, whether it is, accidental discharges of firearms or it's intentional mass, shootings and things like that. People are starting to recognize that it's a health hazard, as we said earlier. And I think that, once we get back to trying to create a solution to that problem, I think it needs to be a comprehensive, I guess, fluid way of trying to, react and figure out exactly what's going to help us. And I don't think it's going to be, just this bill, which is, helping us in the long run. I think it's going to take some more time, some more effort to try and really figure out what the problem is and how to solve it.
Right. One of the other things that I've seen on Facebook that moms have posted is that they worry that when you emphasize additional training and safety precautions in schools, that it may actually cause children to be afraid to go to school. I mean, and certainly, hearing this on the news, that it happened in Noblesville, I think certainly lit up my Facebook page, and they're like, oh my gosh, my kids are, aren't safe anywhere, I've got. And then people are questioning the whole policy about schools not allowing cell phones for kids to have their phones in school. How am I supposed to be able to track my kid, and I don't know where she's going to be, and what. So all of those kinds of policies are going to certainly be reviewed, I'm sure, as part of the safety plans, and I think that's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
But I think that it is. Something about, I think it is easy in Fort Wayne to say that, violence happens over there, in that community, in that part of Fort Wayne. It doesn't happen in my part of Fort Wayne. I looked up, actually, there were, I think, so far as of the end of May, 19 homicides this year in Fort Wayne. Last year, a total of 41. It certainly does happen here. People do die due to violence here in Fort Wayne. But I think that just all of a sudden, it's sort of occurring to people with all of these things that have been happening that it could happen here. I think it's certainly freaking some people out.
Yeah, it's a very real possibility. The Parkland shooting was. The year after I graduated high school, and I was like, that could have been Homestead. That could have been, Snyder, Leo, all these different schools. And when we just look back, Columbine, Sandy Hook, all these different school shootings, like I have one specific memory of when Sandy Hook happened. It was like I walked into class and our teacher was like, you all need to know about this. You all need to hear about this. So when you go home, you're not, blasted with this news about this happening. So that was a very specific memory that I hold on to, just because that was kind of the start of, okay, something needs to happen. And then once Parkland happened, it was just like the final nail in the coffin where I was like, I need to do something about this.
Right. Well, that's a great segue into sort of the next thing that I want to talk about is, so you did something about this. That's just like, I think that's one of the things that's really unique about this whole experience is, especially with the, the kids in Florida. I mean, they took it on.
And it is probably, in my opinion, one of the biggest issues for, our generation is, it's affecting us most frequently. It's affecting us to the point where we're losing the lives of our peers, of our friends at school, that, it's, if it was going to be a single issue election, that's the issue that a lot of kids would care about, a lot of students would care about. And I think, the students down in Parkland are doing a fantastic job of informing people about, how their representatives, how their senators are voting on certain issues, and, what things look like in terms of, funding, and their recent project on price tags. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's like, they divide the number of students in a representative or a senator state that receive money from the NRA, and they put it on a price tag, and they're encouraging students to wear it around to raise awareness on their backpack. So in Indiana, I think it's like $2.31 or something like that. So it's something like that where, you're building awareness in a way that people haven't seen before, and you're building a huge base of people who are ready to receive action and kind of take that next step from becoming an armchair activist to someone who's out there in the community doing work, putting in time, putting in effort to try and make change happen.
Yeah, and I just find that so invigorating personally, because some of the, as you might imagine, the members of the League of Women Voters tend to be a more mature group, although we are trying to recruit young members, and we have a special deal that students can join the League of Women Voters for free now.
Okay.
So if you would like to be an honorary member of the League of Women
I would
Voters,
love
I
to.
will give you a free membership.
That's awesome. Thank you.
And men, even though it's League of Women Voters, and we should just do like KFC and just be LWV, and then people won't know that it's all about women. But we have several men who come to meetings and are participating. Generally, they're the husbands of the women, but that is not a requirement that you be a woman, and it's certainly not a requirement that you be a little old lady. But we're getting tired. We've been, a lot of folks have been, participating in government watch and policy reform for a really long time. And it's just really refreshing to see students come up with really cool new ideas that I never really thought of, using social media and all sorts of tools that we can barely function with and don't even know how to use. We do have a Facebook page. You can go to LWV FW, and our president can tweet. She's president because she knows how to tweet. And we have a website, and the state has a website, and the national has a website, and it's actually very good information. But the whole other Instagramming and other kinds of ways that word gets out that I don't even know how to use, is obviously an effective tool. And I think it's just, one of the things that was exciting about Brandon agreeing to come is that I think it's important to join forces. I mean, there's Moms Against Gun Violence, there's Students Against Gun Violence, there's, a bunch of groups in Fort Wayne that have always been interested. There's a group from a sort of an ad hoc peace group that goes around and blesses the ground where somebody has been shot, and has a prayer service. There's the associated churches and are working with families of violence and trying to get other people in the community sort of at the response level of how do we care for people that have experienced violence. So I think there's a lot of folks that are going at this from a lot of different directions. But I think that one of the things that I find interesting is as we were talking, why was this the straw? What caused you to say, yep, I'm going to do this, and how did you manage to pull this all off in like a day and a half or something? Yeah,
I think the final straw was just, there wasn't any. I mean, there were organizations here that are fighting for, gun control, or fighting for, common sense gun reform, which they think can save lives. And I think that, it was kind of just an amalgamation of, so many events that have happened throughout my entire schooling career. And it was Sandy Hook in 8th grade, and then it was all these other shootings in between. And Parkland, after seeing those students, take action and really rising up, it inspired me to, get out and start working and trying to get this whole thing organized. And it was a Sunday night, and I just said, you know what, I'm going to do this. And so I started a Facebook event, invited a bunch of my friends, and it took off from there. So it was writing press releases every night. It was, staying up till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, working on, organizing speakers and getting all of the other essential elements to the rally together. And it was a long road. It was a long week, but it turned out better than I expected. We had around 400 people there, united for common sense gun control. And there were people from all across the political spectrum there, which was really cool. People who wanted different policy measures implemented, but they all recognized that it was time to do something. It wasn't time to continue to, stay back and, keep passing it off as a problem. It was enough with the thoughts and prayers and time for action.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that really struck me about your approach was from the very beginning, you made it very clear that this was an ecumenical activity. This was nonpartisan. I mean, certainly, from a league perspective, we were willing to participate in that. We jumped on board and had a table to help register young voters, and I think we registered like 12 high school kids.
Yeah.
Who didn't realize, by the way, I will share with you, that if you will turn 18 by November, election day, you can register to vote now.
Yeah.
So do it.
I was one of those voters.
There
So
you go.
yeah, exactly.
There you go. So make sure that, and this was exciting to, these are like, what? I can vote? It's like, you bet. Get your name down here. Let's figure this out. I'll turn this in. You can register to vote online. It's very, very easy.
You can text to vote now, too.
You can text to vote.
Text to register to vote, I should say.
Text to register, yes. Yeah, and it'll take you to that link. IndianaVoters.com. It couldn't be easier. You don't have to have paperwork. You only have to know either the last four numbers of your Social Security number, or if you have a driver's license, your driver's license number. It is easier to vote than to drive a car. Totally. So there is no excuse, and then you have to go vote. I mean, that's the important thing too, obviously. But anyway, so yeah, we were thrilled to be part of that nonpartisan activity, and have been at every gun violence rally since. At least the three that I know of.
Yeah.
Rallying isn't everything. I mean, obviously you need to do the work, and you need to, but it gets people energized.
Yeah, it's taking, I think there are like a couple different levels to activism. It starts at what I call armchair activists. They're willing to, tweet out their opinions or post on Facebook or Instagram things and, do things like that. But, getting them to the next level is, coming to a rally, experiencing what it's like to be there with, hundreds of other people who share a very similar thought process or similar ideals to you. And then it's taking that next step from rallying to, working on a campaign with people who, represent what you believe in, or working with groups like the League of Women Voters or, Moms Demand Action or all these different groups that can try to, work towards policy goals that you agree with and that you can get behind. And just getting behind these individuals or these groups that keep pushing for action and already have a foothold in this community is really vital. Because like you said earlier, uniting together is what really brings us all home. It brings us to, a greater force, a greater power, a greater voice within our community.
Right. And I know that, and there's a lot of armchair things you can do. I mean, you don't even have to leave your home. And I another group that I'm involved with has pointed out, especially at the federal level, I think, local officials are sort of used to hearing from their constituents, and they get some feedback often. You see them around. Sometimes you can talk to them in person pretty easily. But at the national level, I think that it has been shared with me that if a congressman or somebody gets 10 individually written letters, either handwritten or emailed, about an issue, that's a hot topic. Seriously. I mean, it's like, and so, and nobody sends handwritten letters anymore, hardly. And it's challenging because, of the whole anthrax scare. Sometimes handwritten letters don't even get through. It's been recommended that you send them to their regional office, like here at the federal building. And you can certainly hand deliver them there too. Don't take your cell phone because they scan you and you have to go take it back to your car, FYI. But you can certainly mail it to that local office. And then they have a diplomatic pouch kind of system, or they can scan it and send it to them. So you can handwrite a letter and then, scan it and then email that. And it's sort of like a handwritten letter. But at any rate, I have had that. I don't know if that's true, but I think that, certainly, a well thought out individual contact is huge. And with so many of these, Me Too petition kind of things that you can easily do, not saying they're bad, not a bad idea. It's great for people to know that there's a zillion people that are willing to go, yep, me too, me too.
Yep.
But individual contacts are so much, I mean, if you think about it, that's just true anywhere. If you're trying to get somebody to go to a meeting or whatever, if you call them up on the phone and say, are you coming to this meeting? Or if you see them in person and you hand them an invitation, that's a much more effective way to communicate when you really mean it.
Yep. Totally agree.
So I just throw that in. We old school works sometimes,
Totally agree.
Sometimes old school works. Okay, so you've got this amazing coalition of people. You've got 400 people that have gathered at this event. Other events have maybe not had quite the attendance, but they're still moving on. How do you keep the energy up, and where? I think I'll just start there. And
I always tell people that, it's a never-ending fight. When we solve this issue, there's going to be another one that pops up. It's going to be, environmental concerns. There's going to be something like that. And people continue to fight for different causes, and people do get tired out, like you said. But especially with the recent polls that have shown that gun violence particularly, or gun control, is kind of staying more consistent in its search patterns and its search history on Google and things like that. It's showing that this time is different. This time people are staying involved. People are staying up to date with what's going on. And 2018 and 2020 are huge elections. A lot of the people that are accepting NRA money are up for re-election in those years. So I think that that's something a lot of people can get behind in terms of, you are accepting money from an organization which is prohibiting us from trying to do something.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So next steps. Let's end with a challenge. What do you want people to do?
I think people should be out working on campaigns, getting involved in, groups like Moms Demand Action, League of Women Voters, whatever next step they can do to increase their activism beyond, going to rallies, going to, Twitter and doing those things, because all of them are effective. But the best step is to get involved in, campaigns or groups that you can get behind their ideals and their philosophies, so that you can make sure that you are represented in our government.
Right. And if you want more information, the League of Women Voters policy on gun violence and gun safety is on our website, lwvfw.org. You can go to our Facebook page and get more information. This radio show will be posted on our website shortly, as soon as I can get it up there. And if you have more questions or concerns, please get in touch with us, and we will get you connected with the right people who are involved in whatever issue you're interested in. Certainly, there's many things to be concerned about, and that's maybe the topic of a whole nother story. Thank you so much for listening, and we certainly appreciate WELT at the Allen County Library for hosting this event. We will be having another issue to discuss next month, and thank you for listening.